So this is the second part of Chapter 9. This is Section 9b. So we're going to be discussing Section 9.6. And the first thing we want to do is just sort of an opening question is thinking about what would the world be like without plants. So around 500 million years ago, algae carpeted the damp edges of lakes and oceans, but the land was bare. There were no terrestrial or land plants or animals. So, kind of imagine what would our life be like today if plants had not evolved to live on land? Could humans even live on Earth if we didn't have plants, but maybe still had algae? So just kind of think about that, because it is kind of interesting. And also take a minute to think about all the things we get from plants. So it's not just food. There's a lot of other materials that uses plants that we rely on in our day-to-day life. Now, we're going to talk about the four major groups of modern plants. And it turns out these four major groups help to understand sort of the evolutionary history of plants as plants adapted to living on land. So we will start by talking about bryophytes, and then seedless vascular plants, and then gymnosperms, and then angiosperms. And it's thought that sort of the modern day charophyte algae may resemble the algal's ancestor to all land plants that lived at that time. So presumably the ancestor of plants looked something like this. So we're going to walk through sort of these different adaptations that occurred throughout time as plants evolved. So to begin, there was some ancestral green algae that was the precursor of the land terrestrial plants. And one of the first adaptations was the evolution of a waxy outer layer. And this reduced water loss, because remember, once you move to land, you have to deal with the issue of drying out, right? You're no longer living in water. So this is one of the first adaptations, and that was about 475 million years ago. Now at that point, these were non-vascular plants, so they didn't have xylem and phloem. They did not have vascular tissue, and today's bryophytes are most like what plants were like at this time. The next adaptation that occurred was the evolution of vascular tissue and cell walls. And that was about 425 million years ago. We had seedless vascular plants. And this allowed plants to grow taller. So the earlier plants, like mosses, for example, had to be very low to the ground. So they, the adaptation of vascular tissue made it possible for larger plants. The next important adaptation was the origin of seeds. Now, before that, there were not sort of seed structure. So the evolution of seeds freed the gymnosperms, which is the next type of plant that we'll talk about, from the need to reproduce near water. And that opened up new habitats. Before the development of seeds, plants needed to reproduce near water, so it limited where they could grow. And the last adaptation was the evolution of flowers. And this is what you see in today's angiosperms. And this adaptation allowed angiosperms to dominate the land, and that is the majority of plants that we have on land today. So we're going to talk about each one of these groups of plants, but we're going to move through them from the type of land plants that we have today that were most like the earlier plants, and then eventually getting to the ones that are more recent. So we're going to start discussing section 9.7, and here's a few more true-false questions. First, true or false, mosses were some of the first plants to colonize land. So think about that. True or false, there are approximately 12,000 species of moss. And true or false, moss can grow in temperatures just above 0 degrees. Well, it turns out all of these are true, and we're going to start to talk about mosses now. So just a reminder, these mosses are part of the group called bryophytes, and they do not have seeds, they do not have vascular tissue. They have to grow close to water. They have evolved this waxy outer layer that reduces water loss that allows them to be on land. But once again, bryophytes are still dependent on water for reproduction because the seed has not yet developed. So mosses are the most common bryophytes. Bryophytes are seedless, non-vascular plants, but they do have some adaptations for land. They have this waxy outer layer that helps them retain moisture. They have structures that provide internal protection for gametes and embryos, but they do lack seeds and vascular tissues. And modern bryophytes can survive only in a watery environment. The next adaptation was that of vascular tissue, and this was a very important evolutionary adaptation. Nearly all plants except for the bryophytes, including mosses, have vascular tissue. And, you know, vascular tissue is just a series of tubes within the plant that can transport water, minerals, and then food, sugar. And remember, we talked about two types of vascular tissue, the phloem and the xylem. So the job of the phloem is to primarily transport sugars. So phloem contains living cells that transport sugars from where they are made or stored to other parts of the plant. So phloem sap always flows from the sugar source to a sugar sink. So the sugar source is where the sugar is made, and that is the photosynthetic leaves. And the sugar sink is where the sugar is stored. So, for example, this sugar beet, you can see that the sugar sink is actually in the root. So the sugar is made in the leaves, right? The sugar is made via photosynthesis in the leaves, and then it's transported down into the sink, which, you know, if you were to cut this open, you know, and taste it, it would taste sweet. Now the xylem is primarily transporting water and minerals from the roots. So xylem is made up of dead cells that act as tiny pipes, and the xylem sap is moved through the body via a process known as transpiration. What transpiration is water evaporates into the atmosphere from the leaves and the stems, and as that evaporation occurs, remember, via hydrogen bonds, water molecules are connected. And so as water leaves the plant via the stems and the leaves, they actually pull the water up from the roots. Now, tiny pores in the leaf called stomata facilitate the transpiration of water. So during the day, the leaf stomata remains open, and then at night, the guard cells close the pores to prevent unnecessary water loss. But so here you can see the here are the guard cells right in this area, and then the opening is right in here. That's the stomata, or the stoma, and then when it's open, it allows CO2 in, right, for photosynthesis, and oxygen and water out, okay, which are the products of photosynthesis. And then at night, because you don't need this gas exchange during the night, because photosynthesis is not, the light reactions aren't occurring without the light. So then the stoma closes, and that helps to retain water. So we're going to move on and start to talk about now vascular plants, and we're going to talk about ferns. So during the Carboniferous period, which was 360 to 300 million years ago, there were ancient ferns and other seedless vascular plants that formed vast tropical forests. And the fossilized remains of these plants gradually hardened into coal. Think about why vascular tissue might have provided an evolutionary advantage. Remember, as organisms change and they are faced with different environments, remember, those that are best suited for that environment will survive and reproduce, right? So think about, how might vascular tissue provide an evolutionary advantage? So ferns are an example of a type of seedless vascular plant. So it has vascular tissue, it has xylem and phloem, but it does not have seeds. Okay, we kind of take seeds for granted because most of the plants we know have seeds, right? But ferns actually do not have seeds. But they are called seedless vascular plants. But remember, the vascular tissue was a very important adaptation for living on land. And then also the lignin hardened cell walls, and these, allowed plants to be grow taller, right? So think about comparing a moss to a fern, right? So a moss is very low to the ground because there's no vascular tissue. Ferns can grow, they can't grow as tall as trees, but they can, they certainly grow much taller than mosses because of this vascular tissue. So just a reminder, first we talked about bryophytes that were similar to the first terrestrial plants, where there were some adaptations for retaining water, like a waxy layer. And then the next adaptation that was very, very important was the development of vascular tissue, and that's represented in ferns. But at that point, remember, there still is not seeds. So ferns are vascular but seedless. But it does allow plants to grow taller. So here you can see a fern, and you can see the you know, that they can grow taller than certainly mosses. And, you know, here's the roots, here's the lignin, and you know, you can also see the vascular tissue that is found throughout the plant.